24 hours later, Nancy Pelosi's entire political legacy would be shaken. But at that moment, sitting in the PBS studio, preparing to attack Kristi, the life-changing moment hadn't come yet. Until the PBS studio lights glowed with a warm intensity that had become the network's signature. But the atmosphere was anything but warm as two of America's most powerful women prepared for what would become the most explosive political revelation of 2026. It was a crisp March evening, and what was supposed to be a civilized discussion about economic policy and government spending was about to become the most shocking exposure of political corruption in modern American history. Nancy Pelosi, 76, sat with the regal bearing that had defined her decades in power. Her signature pearl necklace catching the studio lights, silver hair perfectly styled, eyes carrying the calculating intelligence that had made her one of the most effective legislative leaders in American history. Across from her, Kristi Noem, 52, adjusted her cream-colored blazer with the confident precision of someone who had spent years building a national political brand, her blonde hair styled in the perfect conservative aesthetic, expression radiating the kind of ambitious energy that suggested she had bigger plans than just governing South Dakota. The moderator, PBS NewsHour's Judy Woodruff, had introduced this as a discussion about fiscal responsibility and economic leadership. But everyone in that studio sensed they were about to witness something far more explosive than budget discussions. The audience of 160 invited guests represented the establishment of American politics, think tank scholars, former government officials, political journalists, and policy experts who had seen decades of political theater but rarely witnessed moments when carefully constructed facades crumbled in real time. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation as the hashtag Pelosi versus them began trending before the debate even officially started. What none of them knew was that Kristi had spent months preparing for this moment, not just with policy papers and talking points, but with evidence that would expose a decades-long conspiracy involving some of the most powerful figures in American politics. Hidden in her briefcase was documentation so explosive it would force the country to confront the reality that its political system had been corrupted at the highest levels by a shadow network of influence peddlers and corporate interests. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of the explosive political drama we cover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. This wasn't just another political debate. This was the moment when America's political establishment collided with someone who had been quietly documenting their corruption for years. Nancy Pelosi had spent the weeks leading up to this debate positioning herself as the elder stateswoman of American politics, the experienced leader who understood the complexities of governance in ways that younger politicians simply couldn't grasp. At 76, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had been at the center of American power for over 3 decades, from her early days in San Francisco politics through her historic tenure as the first female Speaker of the House. Her supporters saw her as a master tactician who had shepherded crucial legislation through Congress while standing up to Republican attacks with grace and determination. Pelosi's legacy was built on her reputation as an incorruptible public servant who had dedicated her life to progressive causes and democratic institutions. Her leadership during the Trump years had made her a hero to resistance liberals who saw her as one of the few politicians willing to stand up to authoritarian impulses. Her role in passing the Affordable Care Act, her management of Trump's impeachments, and her steady leadership during national crises had cemented her status as one of the most consequential political figures of her generation. But behind Pelosi's carefully cultivated image of principled leadership lay something much darker and more calculated. Her private communications and financial records revealed a systematic pattern of using her position to enrich herself and her allies while maintaining the appearance of ethical governance. She had built a network of influence that operated in the shadows, making decisions that affected millions of Americans while serving the interests of a small circle of wealthy donors and corporate partners. Tonight, that network would be exposed in devastating detail. Kristi Noem represented a new generation of conservative leadership, but also something more dangerous to the establishment, an outsider who had been quietly documenting the corruption she had witnessed during her rise through Republican ranks. Born and raised on a farm in South Dakota, she had worked her way through college while helping run the family ranch, giving her a perspective on economic policy that was grounded in real-world experience rather than theoretical frameworks. At 52, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had succeeded in multiple fields: agriculture, business, and politics, while maintaining her independence from the traditional power structures that dominated Washington. Noem's supporters saw her as the authentic voice of Middle America, someone who understood the struggles of working families because she had lived them herself. Her governorship of South Dakota had been marked by a pragmatic approach to economic development and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when it didn't serve her constituents. But her critics viewed her as an ambitious opportunist who used populist rhetoric to advance a traditional conservative agenda that ultimately served corporate interests. What made Kristi particularly dangerous to the political establishment was her combination of insider knowledge and outsider credibility. Her years in Congress had given her access to information about how the system really worked, while her position as a state governor had provided her with the independence to investigate and expose corruption without fear of retaliation for party leadership. Tonight, she would use both advantages to devastating effect. The stage was set for more than just a policy debate. This was a collision between the old guard of American politics and a new generation that was willing to expose the corruption that the establishment had worked decades to conceal. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The ultimate Washington insider against someone who had been quietly building a case against the system itself. As the cameras rolled and Judy Woodruff welcomed viewers to what she called an important conversation about America's economic future, neither Nancy Pelosi nor Kristi Noem could have anticipated that this night would become one of the most talked-about political moments of the decade. The evidence in Kristi's briefcase was about to change everything. Judy Woodruff opened the discussion with what seemed like a straightforward question about federal spending priorities, but the tension between the two women was immediately apparent. Nancy Pelosi, confident in her decades of experience and her reputation as a master of legislative procedure, launched into a familiar defense of government investment in social programs and infrastructure. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had written the book on political strategy, discussing economic policy as if she were the teacher and everyone else in the room were students. The reality that Governor Noem and other Republicans refused to acknowledge, Pelosi began, her tone carrying the patient condescension that had made her both revered and reviled, is that government investment is what built the American middle class. When we invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, we create the foundation for economic growth that benefits everyone, not just the wealthy few. The audience nodded appreciatively. At least the liberal section did. This was vintage Pelosi, the progressive champion who had spent her career fighting for working families against Republican attempts to slash social programs and give tax breaks to the wealthy. Pelosi continued, her confidence growing as she sensed she had the room's attention. Governor Noem comes from a state that receives far more in federal funding than it contributes in taxes, yet she criticizes the very programs that keep rural America afloat. It's the height of hypocrisy to benefit from government investment while attacking it as wasteful spending. Her eyes fixed on Kristi as she delivered what was clearly intended as a personal attack, disguised as policy criticism. When you have politicians who have never had to navigate the complexities of governing a diverse, modern economy, who reduce everything to simplistic talking points about government waste, you get exactly the kind of irresponsible policies that led to the 2008 financial crisis. The studio audience shifted slightly. While Pelosi's attack was more subtle than typical political rhetoric, everyone understood that she was questioning Kristi's qualifications and experience in a way designed to establish herself as the adult in the room. When Woodruff turned to her for a response, Kristi leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that suggested she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Speaker Pelosi, it's interesting that you mention hypocrisy and government waste, she began, her slight Midwestern accent making her words seem more authentic in contrast to Pelosi's polished delivery. because I think the American people deserve to know about some of the waste and hypocrisy that you've been personally involved in for decades. Pelosi's confident smile flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. I've spent my entire career fighting for transparency and accountability in government spending. My record speaks for itself. Does it? Kristi's eyebrow raised slightly. Because I have information that suggests your record tells a very different story than the one you've been telling the American people. The audience was starting to pay closer attention now, sensing that this was moving beyond typical policy disagreement into more personal territory. That's exactly the kind of baseless accusation that Republicans use when they can't win on the merits of their policies. Pelosi shot back, her voice taking on a sharper edge. If you have something to say, Governor, say it directly instead of hiding behind innuendo. You're right, Speaker Pelosi, Kristi replied, her voice remaining calm, but carrying an undertone that made everyone in the studio lean forward. I should be direct, so let me ask you this. Can you explain to the American people why your personal net worth increased from $25 million to over $200 million during your time in Congress? The studio fell silent. Even Woodruff looked surprised by the directness of the question. Pelosi's expression shifted from confident to guarded as she realized this wasn't going to be the typical policy debate she had expected. My family's investments are a matter of public record, Pelosi replied carefully. We've always followed all applicable laws and ethics rules. Following the law and being ethical aren't always the same thing, Kristi responded. But let me be more specific about what I'm talking about. She reached for her briefcase, and the atmosphere in the studio immediately changed. Pelosi's expression shifted from guarded to genuinely concerned as Kristi pulled out a thick folder filled with documents. Speaker Pelosi, before we continue this discussion about government waste and accountability, I think this audience needs to see some documents that tell a very different story about your approach to public service. She opened the folder and pulled out several papers marked with official letterheads. These are financial records, investment portfolios, and communication logs that show a systematic pattern of using inside information and political influence for personal financial gain. Pelosi's face had gone pale. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice losing its earlier authority. "I'm about to expose what might be the largest political corruption scheme in modern American history," Kristi replied, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that made everyone in the studio pay attention. "And you're at the center of it." The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. The confident speaker who had entered the debate had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely frightened by what was about to be revealed. "This is Internal Communication Log 2019 to 2023, Kristi continued, holding up the first document. "It shows a pattern of coordination between your office, your husband's investment firm, and several major corporations on timing legislation to maximize your personal profits." She held up a specific page. "For example, on March 15th, 2020, 3 days before the CARES Act was finalized, your husband purchased $5 million worth of stock in companies that would benefit from the legislation. You had advanced knowledge of what would be in the bill because you were writing it." The audience gasped. This wasn't just about personal enrichment. This was about using a national emergency to make money while Americans were dying and losing their jobs. "But that's just the beginning," Kristi continued, pulling out another document. "This is Communication Record 2021 to 0847, showing how your office coordinated with pharmaceutical companies during the COVID-19 vaccine development process." She read from the document. "The record shows that you received private briefings about which vaccine candidates were most likely to succeed, and your family made strategic investments based on that inside information weeks before it became public." Pelosi attempted to respond, but her voice was barely audible. Those allegations are completely false. Our investments are managed independently." "Independently?" Kristi's voice carried a note of incredulity. "Speaker Pelosi, these documents showed direct phone calls between your office and your husband's investment advisors, coordinated timing of trades with legislative schedules, and systematic use of classified information for financial gain." She pulled out yet another document. This is the smoking gun. Financial Advisory Memo 2022 to 1156, written by your husband's investment firm, explicitly outlining how to maximize returns from legislative inside information and coordinate trading strategies with Speaker's policy timeline. The studio erupted in shocked murmurs. The audience was beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a policy debate. They were learning about systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. Your own financial advisors were documenting how to profit from your position as Speaker of the House. Kristi continued, her voice building with controlled anger. While you were telling the American people that you were fighting for their interests, you were secretly using your power to enrich yourself and your family. But Kristi wasn't finished. She pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. This brings us to what I call the shadow network, she said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was about to reveal something even more explosive. These documents show that your corruption wasn't just personal. It was part of a systematic conspiracy involving dozens of politicians, lobbyists, and corporate executives. She held up a complex organizational chart. This diagram shows the flow of money and influence between your office, your family's financial interests, and a network of supposedly independent organizations that were actually coordinating to manipulate policy for private gain. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about one politician's corruption. This was about a systematic subversion of democratic governance. The shadow network includes think tanks that published research supporting policies that would benefit your investments, lobbying firms that pushed legislation written in your office, and media organizations that promoted your public image while ignoring your financial conflicts, Kristi explained. She pointed to specific names and organizations on the chart. The Brookings Institution, the Center for American Progress, and the Economic Policy Institute all received funding from corporations in which you held significant investments, and their research consistently supported policies that would increase the value of those investments. The audience was riveted now, many looking genuinely shocked by the scope of what was being revealed. But the most damaging evidence, Kristi continued, is what I call the infrastructure conspiracy. She pulled out a final set of documents. These show how you coordinated with construction companies, technology firms, and financial institutions to design the Infrastructure Investment Act, not to rebuild America's infrastructure, but to maximize profits for your network of allies and investors. She read from one of the documents. Internal Planning Memo 2021 to 0923 states, and I quote, "The infrastructure bill provides unprecedented opportunities for wealth creation if we can ensure that contracts are directed to network partners and investment opportunities are secured before public announcement." The studio was completely silent now, the weight of these revelations sinking in. Speaker Pelosi, this memo was written in your office, Kristi said, looking directly at her opponent. You weren't just aware of this conspiracy, you were directing it. Pelosi finally found her voice, but it was weak and defensive. This is a political hit job. These documents are taken out of context or fabricated entirely. Fabricated? Kristi held up the papers. Speaker Pelosi, these are official government communications, financial records from regulated institutions, and internal memos from organizations that your office worked with directly. They're authenticated, documented, and verifiable. She turned to face the cameras directly, speaking not just to the studio audience, but to the millions watching at home. What we're seeing here is the complete corruption of American democratic institutions. We have politicians who use public office not to serve the people, but to enrich themselves and their allies through systematic manipulation of the policy process. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Speaker Pelosi talks about fighting for working families, but her own documents show that she's been systematically working against their interests while pretending to represent them. Every time working families struggled, she found a way to profit from their suffering. She turned back to Pelosi, who was slumped in her chair, looking like someone whose entire world had just collapsed. The Infrastructure Act that you promoted as job creation for working Americans? Your own memos show it was designed as a wealth transfer to your investment network. The healthcare legislation you championed? Your financial records show you profited from pharmaceutical investments while negotiating those bills. The cameras caught individual faces in the audience. Policy experts who looked stunned, political journalists who appeared to be recalculating everything they thought they knew about American politics, ordinary citizens who seemed betrayed and angry. You want to know what real hypocrisy looks like, Speaker Pelosi? Kristi asked, her voice steady but powerful. It's using a position of public trust to build a personal fortune while telling the people who elected you that you're fighting for their interests. She gestured toward the documents spread across the table. These papers document a 20-year conspiracy to subvert American democracy for personal gain. You didn't just participate in this conspiracy, you organized it. The contrast was stark and devastating. Here was Kristi, a politician from outside the establishment, exposing the systematic corruption of someone who had been lionized as a principled public servant. The difference between us, Speaker Pelosi, is simple, Kristi continued. I came into politics to serve the people who elected me. You came into politics to serve yourself. The audience was completely silent now, many looking genuinely shaken by what they had learned. Judy Woodruff, professional journalist that she was, attempted to give Pelosi one final chance to respond. Speaker Pelosi, these are extraordinary allegations. How do you respond to this evidence? Pelosi's answer was telling in its weakness. This is all. This is clearly a coordinated attack using selectively edited documents and conspiracy theories, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've dedicated my life to public service. Dedicated your life to public service? Kristi's voice carried a note of incredulity. Speaker Pelosi, your own documents show that you used that service to accumulate a fortune of over $200 million while millions of Americans struggled with poverty, medical debt, and economic insecurity. She held up the documents again. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are official records showing exactly how you transformed public office into a personal enrichment scheme. The final exchange crystallized everything wrong with American political leadership. Here was a politician who had built a decades-long career on claims of fighting for working families, while secretly using her position to enrich herself and her allies. When confronted with documented evidence of systematic corruption, her only defense was to attack the messenger and deny the authenticity of her own recorded communications. As the segment officially ended, Pelosi gathered her materials quickly, clearly wanting to escape as fast as possible. Gone was the confident speaker who had entered the studio, replaced by someone who looked genuinely defeated by the exposure of her own documented corruption. Kristi, meanwhile, remained calm and composed, accepting questions from audience members who approached her after the cameras stopped rolling. Her performance had been masterful. She had used Pelosi's own documents and communications to expose a pattern of corruption that went to the heart of American democratic institutions. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything PBS had ever experienced. Social media exploded with clips of Kristi's document presentation, reaction videos, and analysis of what this meant for American politics and the integrity of democratic institutions. Hashtag Pelosi Exposed began trending within minutes, followed quickly by hashtag Shadow Network and hashtag Kristi Noem. Political commentators across the spectrum struggled to process what had been revealed. The scope of the alleged corruption was so vast that many initially assumed the documents must be fake or taken out of context. But as financial experts and government accountability organizations began analyzing the evidence, the authenticity and implications became impossible to deny. Liberal media outlets that had lionized Pelosi for decades found themselves in an impossible position. Some attempted to dismiss the revelations as a Republican hit job, but the documentation was too comprehensive and well-sourced to be easily discredited. Others began the painful process of acknowledging that they had been systematically misled about the character and motivations of someone they had promoted as a progressive hero. Conservative commentators, meanwhile, seized on the revelations as vindication of their long-standing claims about democratic corruption, but many also struggled with the broader implications for faith in democratic institutions. If corruption was this systematic and well-documented at the highest levels, what did that mean for the entire political system? Perhaps most importantly, the exposure sparked a broader conversation about the relationship between wealth and political power in America. The documents Kristi had presented weren't just evidence of individual corruption. They revealed systematic problems with how money and influence operated in American politics. Within 24 hours, multiple federal agencies announced investigations into the financial transactions and communications detailed in the documents. The FBI opened a formal investigation into potential securities fraud, while the Securities and Exchange Commission began examining whether the trading patterns violated insider trading laws. Nancy Pelosi attempted damage control with a carefully crafted statement released through her office. The documents presented by Governor Noem are a mixture of fabricated materials and legitimate records taken completely out of context. This coordinated attack on my character and record represents exactly the kind of political desperation that threatens the integrity of our democratic institutions. I have always followed all applicable laws and ethics rules, and I will cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation. But the damage was done. The documents were too detailed, too well-sourced, and too consistent with observable patterns to be dismissed as fabrications or taken out of context. Multiple news organizations began independent verification of the claims, and preliminary analysis suggested that the core allegations were accurate. Kristi's response to Pelosi's statement was swift and devastating. Speaker Pelosi's response proves exactly what I was talking about. When confronted with evidence of systematic corruption, her first instinct is to attack the messenger and deny responsibility. This is why the American people have lost faith in their political institutions. She continued, "The documents I presented tonight aren't fabrications or theories. They're official records that show a decades-long pattern of using public office for private gain. The American people deserve leaders whose personal interests align with the public interest, not politicians who use their positions to enrich themselves and their allies." The broader implications of the confrontation extended far beyond the two participants. The revelations had exposed something that government accountability advocates had long suspected but rarely been able to prove: that systematic corruption could operate at the highest levels of government while maintaining the appearance of ethical governance. It also highlighted the importance of having outsiders in the political system, people who weren't beholden to the established networks of influence and could investigate and expose corruption without fear of retaliation. Kristi's position as a state governor had given her the independence necessary to build a case against the federal establishment. For many Americans, the confrontation served as a wake-up call about the need for fundamental reform of political institutions. The revelation that such systematic corruption could operate for decades while being covered up by friendly media and academic institutions raised serious questions about the integrity of American democracy itself. The debate also demonstrated the power of documented evidence in exposing institutional corruption. Kristi's success hadn't come from rhetorical skill or partisan attacks. It had come from systematically presenting official records that proved corrupt intent and behavior in the target's own words and actions. 3 months after the confrontation, Nancy Pelosi had effectively retired from public life. Multiple federal investigations were ongoing, several of her longtime allies had distanced themselves from her, and her legacy as a progressive champion had been permanently tarnished by the evidence of systematic corruption. The investigations based on the documents Kristi had revealed were expanding rapidly, with federal prosecutors expressing serious interest in the coordination between political offices and private financial interests. Multiple members of Congress from both parties were being examined for similar patterns of using inside information for personal gain. Kristi, meanwhile, had used the moment to build a national platform for government reform and accountability. Her methodical approach to exposing systematic corruption had demonstrated the kind of investigative and political skill that many believed was essential for cleaning up American politics. But perhaps the most important outcome was the broader conversation the confrontation had sparked about the relationship between money and political power. The documents Kristi had presented weren't just evidence of individual corruption. They had revealed systematic problems that required systematic solutions. Congress passed new ethics rules requiring more detailed financial disclosure from members and their families. Federal agencies strengthened oversight of political communications and coordination, and several states implemented new transparency requirements for their federal representatives. 6 months later, when political historians looked back at this moment, they would identify it as a turning point. The night when the hidden corruption of the political establishment was finally exposed for all to see, and when the difference between public service and private enrichment was made crystal clear. The confrontation between Kristi Noem and Nancy Pelosi would be remembered not just as a political moment, but as a crucial accountability moment. A clear example of how systematic corruption could persist under the cover of progressive rhetoric and institutional prestige, and how authentic public servants could expose and combat that corruption. The lesson was simple but profound. In American politics, the fight for integrity required leaders who understood both the importance of transparency and the courage necessary to challenge powerful interests. Pelosi had learned that lesson too late, while Kristi had demonstrated its power in the most public way possible. As the story continued to ripple through American politics, one thing became clear. The age of politicians being able to hide systematic corruption behind partisan loyalty and institutional protection was coming to an end. The Pelosi documents had changed the rules of the game, and authentic reformers like Kristi were the ones best positioned to build a more accountable and transparent political system. This wasn't just the story of a political confrontation. It was a reminder of what political accountability could and should look like when conducted by people with the independence, skill, and courage necessary to expose systematic corruption. It was the night Kristi's documents reminded America that public service was supposed to serve the public, not private interests, and that the fight for that principle would require constant vigilance and occasional revolutionary moments of truth-telling.